Oh, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending where you are. And welcome to the brand new season of the Future of Financial Information webinar series. It feels great to be back. And especially it feels great to be back with such an exciting topic and speaker. So it's my pleasure to welcome Jillian Grenon from Duke University today, who will talk about the impact of AI on high-skilled jobs. So the paper is based on stock analysts, but I have to say it's a title that I find maybe even eerily relevant. So I'm really looking forward to the presentation, and I would also like to welcome Alejandro Lopez-Lira from BI, Norwegian Business School, who will be the discussant today. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So Jillian will present for 30 minutes, and then we will have Alejandro's discussion for about 15 minutes. And we'll spend the rest of the time until we hit the 1 hour mark with the Q&A with the audience. So that said, you don't have to sit on your questions the whole time. Feel free to post them in the chat. So I will keep an eye on the chat, and then I'll make sure to call on you during the Q&A. So without further ado, Jillian, please, the screen is yours for 30 minutes.
Great. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to present. I'm excited that we get to have a chat too at the end in a Q&A. So I would say, feel free to ask many things. I think AI is a super interesting topic, and I have more research projects that I've recently started on it. And so I'm excited to, talk with everybody who's interested in the future of financial information. It's an amazing topic. There's a lot of research to be done, and I think some of the theory work is out there, and now we need to get the data to test it, and it's going to be very cool to see how this literature develops. So with that, I will share my screen. I am sharing it. Okay. So this is joint work with Roni and Michaely at the University of Geneva. And, hopefully I don't have to motivate it for this audience, but AI is really just this amazingly powerful form of automation. And what it's known for is improving prediction. And it's going to basically program machines to act more like humans through prediction. And there's so many applications. So there's applications, we've seen many this year with the pandemic, and trying to, solve problems of diseases and finding the optimal molecules, but there's also applications in finance, there's applications in driverless cars, there's applications in almost every aspect of life. And so it's really considered sort of the general purpose technology of our era, the way the steam engine could have been considered the general purpose technology of a previous century. Okay, and the numbers actually are in for 2020. I didn't update them, but 2019 they raised 70 billion. The startups were 40 billion of that. If you look at 2020, despite the pandemic, despite money not going there, the amount raised for AI was actually up. And so, what is this doing, and what does this lead us to think about? Well, one of the key things we want to understand is actually a bigger picture labor question. Much of the previous changes in technology and technological innovation have impacted lower skilled workers rather than higher skilled workers. And, it could be exactly the same for AI, or it could be different. And so there's sort of a rich literature on old technologies suggesting there's massive displacement and tension there. But AI could actually, because it focuses on high skilled workers, lead to changes in inequality, or lead to sort of an exacerbation of some of the problems that we have now, where it could level the playing field, because all of a sudden, what we previously didn't compensate as well, social skills might become more valuable. And so these are the type of questions we're going to go after, but we're going to study it in the context of research analysts. And why? Well, I think Joyce Chang, who still continues to be the head of global research at JP Morgan, her quote made it really evident. With 80% of the data created in the world in the last 2 years, judgment matters more than ever. Technology is a complement to sound judgment and knowledge, not a substitute. This tension between if big data, which is going to be sort of one of the aspects of AI that we look at, is it complementary to analysts or is it sort of displacing analysts? That's the question we're after. And so what we do and why we think the stock analyst context is amazing is because, you just have such a well-defined prediction problem. You're forecasting earnings, you're forecasting price movements. We have detailed data about performance and tasks. And one of the things we're going to bring into it is sort of new skills. So we're going to focus on the social skills as well as the hard analytic skills of analysts. And then you have meaningful variation in AI intensity. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little bit of a background on how AI is being used in asset management. So there's basically many firms using AI to do what analysts do. So just a rapidly expanding set of market intelligence fintechs, streamlining and synthesizing many data sources relevant for investment recommendations. Originally sort of started more with market data, news reports, Twitter, Reddit. He's been in the news a lot lately. People are out there, they're analyzing all of this and basically using it to extract signals. And to make a plug for that, Roni and I have a separate paper that's forthcoming now where we sort of cataloged what they're doing in this space, and sort of everything from scope to speed to the scale of information. That's sort of what they're going after. But as we sort of show in our paper, the vast majority of it is bad. Okay, you can't really extract a signal from 90% of the data. And so it's actually using the AI to isolate those pieces of data, finding that needle in the haystack, finding that useful piece of information. Okay, and this is sort of the problem, that there's so much information out there, it's impossible for a human to actually process it. You need the tools and the computing power to process it. And so this is exactly what asset managers are doing. So this is from alternativedata.org, and they put together some predictions, and they suggest last year they thought it was going to be 1.7 billion in spending on alternative data. And actually, if you look at them, what they're spending most of their money on is essentially, web scraping data, credit card data, sentiment scores. So this is basically news textual analysis. But then you see down here more stuff that we're going to look at too, or we've started to look at it, which is like web traffic or satellite images and geolocation data. Okay. So now that you have the background on how it's being used, let's talk about how what's being used in the asset management industry might actually be affecting analysts. Are they adopting it? Are they all of that stuff? So to think about where we're going to get our measures and how to think about it, because I'm really an empiricist at heart, is we think of data abundance as our measure of AI intensity. Okay. And so given that, how are we getting it? Well, we're getting it as the quantity of social media data that TipRanks processes for a given stock in a quarter. And to put it in perspective, sort of Apple, Facebook, Tesla, they get disproportionate social media attention. It's 100x relative to household names like Starbucks and Coca-Cola. It's like 1,000 to 10,000x relative, like, more smaller micro cap stocks. Okay. So for our sample, we're covering 2010 to 2017. That was the data that TipRanks was able to give us. TipRanks is, you might not know them, but they are, they might be going public soon, but they are integrated, fully integrated into E-Trade. They also have their own platform. They also, just like Robinhood and many of the other startups out there, sell their data to hedge funds as a signal. Okay. So why does AI intensity matter in this context, this data abundance view of it? It matters because social media produces crowd wisdom. Okay, the GDA has a lot of work on this. I have some work on this. Other people do. It produces crowd wisdom, and the analysts, what their job is to figure out some unique trading angle. If you have all these other people putting out ideas, that makes it harder and harder to find a unique, good piece of information, a good trading angle. Okay, so they feel this pressure even if they may not be paying attention to these bazillions of pieces of data that are out there. So in this sense, we think that analysts are actually great to study because you both have this potentially direct effect of them adopting some of these tools in their job or potentially using them, or you have this sort of indirect effect that's coming directly from competition induced by the fact that, AI can essentially be adopted by anybody. They can go look at this TipRank score and trade off of it. I mean, they have to have a subscription, but that is sort of the way the world's working. So what are our hypotheses? What are we actually testing now that I've told you the data? Well, to build it up and think about it, think about an analyst job. Okay, and the key economic tension we're going to focus on is AI labor augmenting, or is it a task displacing technology? And so this really builds off of David Otter's work on defining jobs as task-based. And so that's where a lot of the literature has went. And so, when we think of globalization, they always called it, skill bias technological change or whatever, because it was going towards particular tasks. It's basically asking the same thing as global trade. We're sort of doing the same framework, but analyzing it from the perspective of AI. And it leads to the first question of substitutes. Are analysts switching careers? If so, where are they going? Then a question of complementary data. So does AI free up analyst time? Yay. But then what are they going to focus on when they have freed up time? Are they going to do new tasks? Are they going to double down on other tasks? Where are they going? And so we think we're going to look at their social skills and their advantage over tech, which is gathering soft information. And then finally, what's unique about analysts is that we can then look at product quality. Okay, and so automation in a manufacturing firm, they often don't know the product quality. We know how good their forecasts are. We know, if it's sort of maybe coming from an effort or a strategic channel, and we can finally relate it to compensation. So just to preview our findings, we find, yes, analysts, especially high-skilled ones, are leaving the profession. So this suggests there's some element of substitution. And we also find it on the intensive margin. We find analysts shift their coverage from high AI stocks, defined by this data abundance, to low AI stocks. So they're going after sort of the hidden gems in some sense, or where they might have more value added. We see complementary tasks as well. So this suggests, AI is not a single moving the supply and demand curve. It actually has some nuance. And this is, we see them having more meetings with management and institutional investors. We also see on earnings calls, they change the type of questions they ask, which I think is super cool. They're asking more complex questions. They're asking questions about intangibles and things that are harder to predict. Okay, and then product quality. So what do we do with product quality? Well, we're going to look at analysts, and then we're going to look at their forecast. And we see that their forecasts improve on average. The consensus improves, but there's meaningful heterogeneity here, and harder to disentangle exactly where it's coming from, but it's suggestive of effort. And finally, we do find some indirect evidence consistent with decreased compensation, that basically because the other people are finding the trades first, it's harder for them to be unique, and so they're not getting rewarded as much. So with that, I have the chat open. If I don't have any questions, I'm assuming right now with the intro, then I will just go straight into some of the more details of the paper, but feel free to stop me. I can monitor the chat. Okay.
So there are actually a couple of questions. It's just that I direct them to me so that you're not distracted.
Oh, okay.
But would you like to take them now?
Yeah, or? I think this is a good break point to take questions.
Okay. So both are from Roxana Michet, who's asking, first of all, is there evidence that sophisticated asset managers are obtaining better signals from these alternative sources of data than retail investors? You'd expect so because of their size and economies of scale. So that's maybe speaking to your other paper with Roni, or?
So it does a little bit. I would say that, so I think the hedge funds were early to want to extract signals, and they're asking for more customized signals, and they're able to get stuff like that. That being said, the AI has become so powerful, and it's sort of, you can buy a membership to TipRanks and you can see a smart score. Now, I usually typically share it with different people, but they have definitely created their retail one to look, it goes from red, this is bad, all the way up to green on a scale of 10. And you can dive into all the details of the data and understand where they're getting, they're trying to work on sort of economically interpretable AI. And you can get all these details, but at the same time, it's presented in just sort of, classic retail investor behavioral bias. Let's look at this, pretty figure and go for the green stocks. So obviously, the hedge funds have more nuance there. Any other questions?
Yeah, the second one was whether the fact that the stock is heavily covered on social media, does that equal that it's AI intensive? Because information could be very bad, and worst case, even like fake news, misleading.
Right. So I think that is something that so first of all, I do think that social media data does have information in it, and that was sort of the point I was trying to make about, it challenges them no matter what. I think it's thinking about AI and recognizing that it's not just, and this is another reason why I think it's so unique from previous technological changes, is it's not that it's just a capital that the firm invests in themselves. The competition is largely coming from outside, and anybody can adopt this technology. And so the competition thus is a little bit different than sort of, if you think of your classic IO literature where you had this first mover advantage if you were the firm to adopt AI first. And so I will talk about this. This is something that we've actually spent a lot of time on since this summer, where we've tried to collect new data. And one of the coolest ones I thought, I finally had this insight, so I will share it because it was one of those fun insights to have, is the sources. Under the figures in analyst reports, they have to put their source data. And I finally saw that they started saying, sources ThinkNum or sources like this other fintech firm. And I finally realized that we could figure out who is using these alternative data sources. And so this is something we're actually currently working on, is incorporating this data of, people who, ex post do use fintechs. We've also gathered data. There's this cool data set out of Stanford that I got on firms that license big data. So Facebook sells out. I didn't realize Facebook licenses so much of its data, but several, you can see those agreements between banks and sort of Facebook, or brokers essentially. And we also have looked at all the fintech acquisitions by brokers, and we've pulled that in to understand. So RBC, for example, did many big fintech acquisitions. So you would assume that they're one of the more teched up analyst groups. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thank you very much.
So with that, let's get into the regressions. We do it at multiple levels. Although our variation is always at the stock level, I think it's important to sort of understand is to aggregate it to the analyst level or to think of it as at an analyst stock level. So I will say that in some of our regressions, so specifically some of the things like quitting, we do play around with the timing a little bit in the sense that it's not obvious to me that, you get a really intense AI stock and you're going to quit that exact same quarter. So you're quitting the next quarter ahead, or same thing with adjusting your portfolio. It's looking next quarter, whereas some of them where it's more obvious that it would affect it, in a particular quarter, like the questions you're asking, we're just doing it contemporaneously. Okay. All right, the OLS evidence, I always like to look at it just to see, we know it's biased, we know that there's omitted variables, we know that, but in some sense you might actually think, hey, Analyst follows 15 stocks, there's some random subset of the stocks that just happen to go viral, and so they're getting a lot of social media attention right now. Who would have known that GameStop would get so much attention? And that's sort of what we're looking at. And so when that happens, what happens to the analysts? Okay, it seems like it could be both directions though. It could understate the true effect if you think about complex information environments, or it could overstate the true effect. That's really about these sort of unexpected news events. And so, I don't think that there's much you can get from the conditional correlations, but at the same time, it's not that we should think it's always going to be one direction. So how are we going to try and solve the fact that, it's not random that you get social media attention, or really? So we use headline length as an IV for AI intensity. Headline length has a really unique feature. Even online, headlines are still determined by advertisement sales. Okay. Anybody who writes a news article, it is separate. The editor determines the headline. It's separate from the person who wrote it. And if you are in a print edition, how big the thing is, that's what affects the headline. Same thing in the online environment about the advertisement. And so there's evidence suggesting when you see a short headline, you get an idea. Okay, you go and blog about it, or you go put it on Twitter, or you go put it on Reddit. Okay, that's exactly what we're going after. And so this quasi-randomization in headline length, we think leads to basically more social media. And we confirm a strong first stage, so that's definitely there. We're using the US news, but we've looked at a multiple variety of them. And this is just to show you that it's really true. This is when the Wells Fargo scandal broke in 2016. So you might think, oh, these short ones, Wells Fargo gets heat, Wells Fargo fined for sales scam. And then you see that they literally go to these like 100+ character headlines where Wells Fargo fired for 5,300 workers for a sales push. It's all the same story. And so this is basically the variation we're using, is if they are a short headline. And then the way we're aggregating it to the quarter is like, if on average there's shorter headlines in the quarter. You might worry that the exclusion restriction is violated because, the editor exhibits selection bias. This is 7 million headlines, and we see little selection bias, okay? And I also think it's sort of interesting that the R-squared is so low. In contrast, if you were to look at sort of sentiment or other things, you might see, if the variable was there, you would see that log or momentum seem to be associated with sentiment where it's not associated with headline length. Okay, the other worry is that maybe it's just what I was saying before about a complex news environment, something's going on. So we look at earnings surprises and non-earnings events, and we look at other key events. This is a cool data set out of Capital IQ about sort of key events, and we see no relationship between headline length and key events. Here we're limiting it to just the USA Today newspaper headlines, because that's what we ultimately use, because the evidence suggests that's what retail investors read as opposed to the financial workers. So the relevance of the instrument, you might worry that there's no info in it, it's just the same idea 10 times. This is where we were saying it's the crowd system. And so this is Tony Cookson's work, this is Jida's work, some of my work. Thinking about the headline shock, is it a permanent or a transient one? I think it's both. So we see some people that go to sort of this, absorbing state. If you think of your old Markov chains, in other cases, that's not the case. And then I talked a little bit about our alternative proxies. So this fintech acquisitions and stuff. We've also worried that social media might just be one aspect of big data. And so in that sense, we've tried to create alternatives. So sort of when does the social media data go against the AI score? I think that one's super interesting. And then also just sort of we started to look at web traffic and sort of different things that we could say, okay, this is a different data set. Does it seem similar or different? Okay. So what do we find? Well, we find that they quit. And we find that the highly accurate analysts quit. When we put it in an economic perspective, and I've done this in the paper, it actually is meaningful in terms of, you can sort of see it in the figure. So, there was lower quit rates during the, so this is over time. So this is from 2005 to basically the end of our sample. And you can see this, sharp tick up in quit rates. And then who's quitting? This is the highly accurate analyst quitting. And then what do we have on this axis? It's just showing you to make you understand that it is a meaningfully higher quit rate than in previous periods of time. Okay. And then this is what I thought is really cool. And we've now worked to expand this sample, and we're still continuing to see it. We went and looked up people on LinkedIn, and we said, what role are you going to? What's your next job? And there's certainly people are going to the buy side and stuff like that. But what I thought was so fascinating is this investor relationships and fintechs and entrepreneurship. And actually, if you look at it in the data, what we can see, now this time we've changed it. So we see that fewer people over time are going to research jobs, more people are going to these non-research roles. And you can see it in regression format. So in particular, those few analysts that we look at, if they had a higher percentage of AI stocks or high intensity AI stocks in their portfolio, they're more likely to leave for non-research. Basically, they go to a non-research job, they're less likely to go to a research job. So that to me is just sort of tells you that this is the mechanism, that what is going on is they are feeling this pressure. And so they see the writing on the wall. They're not going to do research anymore. They think that their role is probably better in a non-research setting. They don't want to compete with the AI or all of this stuff out there. And this is robust across many things. I can talk about that later. The intensive margin. So this is where we ask, are you changing what stocks you cover. So maybe it's just like, oh, I had bad luck. I got 1 or 2 high AI intensity stocks. I don't want to be competing with them. I'm going to go cover something else. And this is exactly what we see. So they end up, if a stock has higher AI intensity, they're much less likely to initiate coverage on it. And they're also more likely to stop covering a stock with high AI intensity. Okay. And this is robust. So we're putting industry analyst, stock, and year fixed effects. So this is very, very strong fixed effects. Obviously, you can't put all of them in, but at the same time, but we are able to see this across a variety of settings, and they still have full sort of stock, analyst, and news content controls. So we really think that this is, cannot be explained by something else. And the first stage F stat is clearly strong, strong T stat on the IV as well. Okay, we run some more robustness. I'm not really going to go into it given my timing, but it seems to hold in if you're thinking about sort of the fact that our instrument is a little bit of a shift share design, and so we're taking seriously the critiques of the Bartik instrument. So what we found: career switching, stocks moving away, so that's substitution. So now I'm going to go into this sort of talk about the complementary skills, these soft skills. Should we be focusing on our hard skills or our soft skills? What can we do? And this is what I think is really cool. So this is the earnings call. So we're looking at just total questions and question length. If the stock has high AI intensity, more questions are asked, more question length, which is sort of counterintuitive. You might not have expected that, especially if, oh, the AI is helping to predict earnings better. Why don't I have as many questions? And then the question content, I think this is what's really cool. So easy to measure. So we're looking at words like sales, profit, prices, something that like sort of is clear that what's AI good at, and then versus hard to measure things. So this is things like engagement, culture, more intangible stuff. And we see that they're asking more questions about hard to measure stuff and fewer questions about easy to measure stuff. Okay. And so I found that really, this suggests that, again, this social skill is the mechanism. And then this is one more of that, which is their shift to in-person meetings. So this is the unique data set that we got. I think we're one of Eric, so I just saw has a new paper on it too, but we're one of the first people to sort of look at it, and we see they're increasing their meetings with analysts. So this is total meetings, but they're increasing their meetings with management and their meetings with institutional investors. In total, it's basically they're adding about 1 additional meeting per month that they're having. And so we think of this as, this is their time to sell. This is the time for them to engage in this sort of social skills. And then we look at the forecast. So this is where we see they're increasing their accuracy and reducing their bias. And we also see that they're making bolder forecasts. So this, bolder forecast could be greater effort. It could be attention seeking. It's sort of hard to say, but, overall, this is suggestive that on average, yes, they are improving their forecasts. And we've also done it with a consensus estimate and see it there as well. So this suggests that, AI also complements soft skill tasks. We've seen it, and this is leading to an improvement in product quality. And then finally, the market reaction. This is sort of an indirect way of looking at earnings. Okay, it's impossible to know earnings of analysts. That data is not disclosed, but we do know that they have strong incentives that are often powered by basically, what is the excess return, or how do the trades get driven through your brokerage house after your announcement. And we see that this is, analysts by stock fixed effects actually, and you can look at pre and post the period, and what we're seeing is that there is less excess returns and there's lower excess volume. Okay, when they make their announcements, when it's for high AI intensity stocks. So that suggests, in some sense, this information is already incorporated in there, but also people just aren't paying attention to them as much. So their unique trading idea is no longer as unique, and so they're not being rewarded as much for that. Okay, so the AI has taken away part of what the information they conveyed. So in conclusion, I think it's a fun, wonderful area. We're looking at AI and its role for people traditionally tasked with high skill type work. We think that while focusing on Analyst is very specific. It has broader implications for, management type of jobs or jobs where you do have this mix of analytics and social skills. Okay. So obviously that's one of the limitations, but hopefully the takeaway that you have is that, job nature is going to be changing. We're going to be moving potentially from a more analytics advantage to an advantage coming from soft skills. And so in part of this means that there's going to be a shuffling of talent across the line. And, people who previously may have been the most talented analysts might be leaving because they, their talent advantage probably came from their quantitative skills, and they want to go move elsewhere or do something like that. And so understanding sort of this reallocation of talent and really going to be interesting aspect to look at, as well as how the analyst role evolves moving forward. But I look forward to the comments from Alejandro, and I thank you guys for having me.
Thank you very much, Jillian. So spot on time. And this indeed, let us move to Alejandro. So you have the screen for 15 minutes.
Okay. So first, just can everyone see the screen and hear me? Just can you confirm? Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I think it's very nice. I love this webinar series because it's always showing us like new interesting data sets, new interesting ideas, and how it's gonna turn out for finance. So thanks again, to Michael. And okay, yeah. So sorry, let me just move the Zoom thing out of the for me. So I think this is a very nice paper providing causal evidence of the impact of artificial intelligence on high-skilled labor, right? And that's a really big deal. So whenever we think about like making jobs like making tools that will decrease the amount of jobs, we usually think like constructors, things like that. But it's natural to think, and in fact, like prediction is a hard problem, right? Like predicting something involves like a lot of intelligence, involves a lot of data sets. Involves a lot of tools that you have to utilize to make the best forecast possible. And we know that at some point there's going to be some limitations for humans, right? So normally algorithms are better at predicting, and it's natural to think that this will lead to some substitution effect. What I also really like about this paper is combines like so many databases. Like I just learned so much just by reading the database they're using, and I encourage everyone to take a look at the paper. So they use like analyst efforts from conference calls, their accuracy, their bias, their meetings efforts, social media as the inputs for tip ranks. They use career data from LinkedIn. They use like analyst recommendations from IBS, market value of analyst recommendations, and even these news headlines data. So it's just a very complete project, and I really appreciate all the effort that went into answering a very important question. Now, the results of the paper are essentially broken into two parts. So the first one is substitution. So it turns out that analysts are leaving the profession at significantly higher rates when the stock they cover have higher AI intensity, right? What does it mean? It means that if you're an analyst, you usually cover around 8 stocks, 8.5. If you usually on average, like two stocks will be very highly AI intensive, which the paper argues it's a measure of how good AI is to analyze those. If suddenly instead of those 2 firms you have an extra 2 firms, you are significantly more likely to exit the profession. So the average baseline rate for leaving the profession per analyst quarter is 3.9%, and then if your portfolio increases with 2 more stocks with high AI intensity, you'll get like an extra 0.3% or an extra 0.6%, depending on the specification. This is also very problematic for the very highly accurate baseline rate. So it's only 0.7%. So very highly accurate analysts do not leave the profession that much, which makes sense. But there's a huge increase in the relative to the baseline whenever the firms that are covered transition to being more AI intense. It's also the case that analysts are departing at higher rates during the sample. I think Jillian did a very good job of explaining the results. right? And also, it seems that analysts are not completely oblivious to this, and they're shifting their coverage towards low AA stocks. So instead of trying to compete, they're moving away from those stocks. So the increase in AI stocks, it's consistent with analysts decreasing the coverage of those stocks and failure to initiate the coverage on those same stocks. Those are very interesting results that point out that there's a substitution effect going on in the high-skilled labor market due to the artificial intelligence. It turns out analysts also leave for a non-research job. I think there's a lot of interesting things to do there, and exactly what are they trying to do after they lose the job. But I think that may be like enough for a different project. So in summary, like, the first results of substitution is that there's evidence that AI involves some direct substitution via displacement in high-skilled jobs. So they present like very convincing evidence on that regard. Now, interestingly enough, and this is courtesy of Jay Reader, so there used to be a survey of what investors really want, right? So what I'm showing you here is the 12 attributes that investors consider more important from an analyst. This was also very puzzling to me, right? If you're looking at sell-side equity research attributes, essentially people value everything except the earnings estimates and the stock selection. So all of these soft skills are actually what people value more, right? So it would make then sense to ask the question well, maybe then analysts can transition to this soft skill, right? Like maybe they can have like more written reports, more special services, more meetings, other things that, well, clearly machines cannot just like, write a very good written report. Let's put it like that yet, right? So that comes up with a question of the paper. Then, well, maybe there is some complementarity going on, right? I'll send you the slides later. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. Yeah, so it turns out that analysts are at least like shifting their behavior towards what investors really want, like, once faced with competition. So they document very nicely that analysts ask significantly more questions and more complex questions when AI intensity is higher. They do this like using the conference calls, which is a very cool data set. So relevant for the future of financial information. They find that analyst accuracy improves, that the bias decreases, that the consensus forecasts improve, and analysts deviate more from the consensus. And I didn't mention here, but I also find like some evidence of increased efforts. But nevertheless, that the market is less responsive to analyst recommendations when AI intensity is high. So maybe despite all of this, and because the investors are not really are concerned about the earnings estimates and the stock selection, but they're concerned about like more soft skills. That's why the market reaction is not benefiting from the increase in effort. But anyways, I thought it was a very interesting set of results, and I almost thought like maybe this is enough for another paper. Like the paper is like really it's a huge project. I really like it. Oops. Okay, so the soft skills that I was speaking a little bit about, they measure this using the participation in meetings with managements and the complexity of the questions that analysts ask and the number of questions that analysts ask, which I thought was like very, very, very smart and very relevant. Now the important thing, one of the important things about the paper is how are they measuring this propensity to be, reached by AI for the firms. Like that is how hard it is for an artificial intelligence program to understand the stock versus that of a humans, right? So what they do is we have the tip ranks, which is an interesting website. I encourage everyone to look at it. I've been in contact with them trying to get some analyst reports. And then essentially tip ranks, they give you like, a score whether the stock will outperform or underperform. And as you can see, this is measured by analyst ratings, blogger opinions, hedge fund activity, insider trading, tip ranks investors, new sentiment, technical analysis, that's price analysis, and fundamentals, right? So now the AI intensity in the paper in the current version is defined as the degree of AI-based competition. So that's literally, you know, for a given firm, how much are the analysts suffering because AI is entering the space, right? And this is proxied by the number of social media posts that can be linked back to a particular stock. So what I understood from that part was that the AI is using different number of social media posts for different firms, and because there's a huge cross-sectional variation in that, we can use that as a sensible measure, right? So essentially, how many posts the AI uses for each stock. I was very much convinced that there's very much cross-sectional variation in there. And the high A intensity for technical definitions is just the top quartile of social media coverage in a given quarter. Now, the only potential issue that I was able to find with the paper is that it may be picking up stock popularity rather than how good or hard it is for humans to understand that stock, right? Because if it turns out the artificial intelligence is using more social media posts because there's more social media posts and everyone's crazy about the stocks. So for example, like GameStop comes to my mind. Then it's a little bit hard to disentangle whether it's actually the increasing competition or the increasing stock popularity. Now, I thought about like potential fixes, including like, I know you're working on different measures. So the very first one would be like the quick one, just orthogonalize the measure by projecting it into total social media coverage, and then just use the residual and the intercept for that regression as your measure. Now, these are all essentially robustness checks, but I hope this will be helpful. Another one that I thought about is instead of trying to proxy how hard it is to predict the company for humans and AI, you could also consider just using the past forecast errors from AI and the past forecast analysts for each firm, and make the assumption that this is stationarity in some sense. And if the AI is having like problems with some stocks but not with others, you could also consider using that as a measure of AI intensity. Another one that I thought was like, why not using very extreme recommendations as the AI intensity? So if we look back at the score, like, in Facebook it's like 10 outperform. So that's a clear recommendations by the AI that you should do this. And it's very plausible to think that if the AI is just suggesting 5, well, then no one really cares. Whereas if it's suggesting 10, it may be more helpful, right? And in fact, because the AI measure uses the analyst ratings, my guess is there could be some cases where the analyst rating differs from the other sources of data that the AI is using. So you could consider using those stocks where there's like more difference in opinion between the analyst rating and the AI as the measure of AI intensity. So those are details that I'm gonna think that the potential referee is gonna ask for these robustness checks, but the results are very good. I really like the identification. I think it's very cool. I think it's worth mentioning again for the purpose of these conferences. So they use the short headlines in the USA Today newspapers, and because the headline length varies and the variation is quasi-random, because it's due to editorial space constraints, then it's almost like the perfect instrument. I'm thinking like this cannot only be used in this A intensity, but I'm sure a lot of people working with text analysis and news would consider this as a very attractive instrument. And of course, the intuition is that short titles attract readers. And well, this headline length is essentially not correlated with any finance variable we can consider. So just to conclude, I'm going to finish like a minute earlier. I think it's a great paper. I think it's a very important question, right? How much is AI going to impact the high school jobs, right? Like even for us professors, we wonder if one day we could be substituted by very, very smart machines. I think it has like so many cool data sets. I think it has a very clever identification, and I was very, very convinced by the results. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandro, for the discussion. So kind of confirms to me that it was a good choice to pick this paper for the webinar series.
It's